The Wyoming wind tasted of dust and regret as Elias Holt handed over silver coins for the wagon's grim cargo. 5 figures bound, hooded with coarse burlap sacks. Runaways, the auctioneer sneered. Cheap labor or trouble, take your pick. Elias, a widower hollowed by solitude, bought them only to set them free miles from this squalid outpost. As he cut the first rope, a gust tore at the sacks. From the smallest figure came a whisper, thin as smoke, yet it struck him like a bullet. Elias? He froze, ice flooding his veins. Who knew his name in that forsaken place? And what ghost from his buried past had he just bought? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extra special saved just for you. The wagon groaned, a weary beast protesting every rut and stone on the trail, leading north from the nameless, shameful crossroads where Elias had made his purchase. Dust, fine as ground bone, lifted in swirling veils behind the wheels, momentarily obscuring the 5 silent figures huddled within the wagon bed. Each wore the demeaning sack, anonymous and dehumanized. Elias kept his eyes fixed on the twin ribbons of trail, unwinding towards a distant, brooding silhouette of the Bitterroot Peaks, purple teeth gnawing at the fading sky. He dared not look back. Elias, the name echoed in the hollow chamber of his skull, louder than the wagon's complaints or the wind's mournful sigh through the sagebrush. It wasn't just a knowing of his name, it was the way it was spoken, not a question flung by a stranger seeking confirmation, but a recognition, a fragile thing pulled from deep water, laced with shock that mirrored his own. A woman's voice, young, frayed by fear and exhaustion yet familiar? Or was it merely the desperate hope of a lonely man conjuring connections in the void? He clenched the worn leather reins until his knuckles shone white against the tan hide. 10 years. 10 years since Cora's laughter had ceased, since the silence had settled over Whispering Pines Ranch like a suffocating shroud. 10 years since anyone had spoken his name with anything resembling intimacy. The decision to buy them had been a spasm of conscience, a rebellion against the grinding apathy that had become his existence. Passing the crude auction block, little more than a raised plank platform near a fly-blown trading post, the sight of those hooded shapes, the casual cruelty in the auctioneer's leer, had pierced the fog of his grief. He hadn't planned it. The coins were meant for supplies, seed grain maybe. Instead, they bought 5 souls bound for God knew what misery. He told himself he'd drive them clear the county line, cut their bonds, point them toward the rumored sanctuary of a distant mining town, and leave them to fates he couldn't bear to shepherd. A clean, if distant, act of mercy. Now, that fragile plan felt like ashes in his mouth. The sun bled out over the western ridges, staining the high clouds crimson and orange, a violent beauty that felt like mockery. Long shadows stretched across the sage-dotted plain, transforming the landscape into a monochrome tapestry of grays and deep blues. The air grew sharp, carrying the scent of cooling earth and the distant metallic tang of snow from the peaks. Elias pulled his worn sheepskin collar tighter. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The runaways were motionless, lumps of shadow in the gathering dusk. Only the faintest tremor in one figure. The smallest, the one who had spoken, betrayed any life beneath the coarse fabric. Her hands, bound loosely at the wrist now, rested in her lap. Small hands, he noted absently, the knuckles scraped raw. Cora had small hands. The thought ambushed him, sharp and unwelcome. Cora, whose hands had been calloused from ranch work, but gentle as dove wings on his cheek. Cora, taken by the coughing sickness that swept through the valley like a vengeful spirit the winter after they buried their infant son, Michael. 2 graves beneath the lone cottonwood by the creek. 2 voids that swallowed light and sound. He'd built walls then, thick and high, shutting out the world, letting the ranch shrink back to its bare essentials, letting the silence become his only companion. Until today, until the whisper. Why him? What cruel twist of fate had placed that particular runaway on that block at that moment? Was it merely chance, or the cold hand of a past he thought he'd outrun. He searched the fragmented corridors of memory. Faces blurred, neighbors from a life before solitude, drifters who'd worked the season. The few townsfolk he still encountered for absolute necessity. None fit the haunting timbre of that voice, muffled by burlap, yet resonant with a shared history he couldn't place. Had she known Cora? Known Michael? The possibility was a physical blow, a fist squeezing his heart. He couldn't afford hope. Hope was a luxury that had died with them. The wagon crested a low rise. Below, nestled in a shallow valley where Silver Creek wound like a discarded ribbon, lay whispering pines. The name was a relic of better times, a romantic notion Cora had cherished. Now, the pines whispered only of loneliness. The single-story log cabin hunkered low, smoke curling weakly from its stone chimney. The barn leaned slightly, its timber silvered by wind and sun. A corral held only emptiness. Beyond, the creek glinted dully in the twilight, and the dark wall of pines pressed close, guardians of his isolation. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was shelter for the night. He couldn't push the horses or the women further in the dark. As the wagon descended the slope towards the creek crossing, Elias's senses, honed by years of weary solitude, prickled. Something was off. Not just the unnatural silence of his passengers, nor the oppressive weight of the unknown he carried. Something in the land itself. He scanned the far ridge, backlit by the dying embers of the sunset. Nothing moved but a hawk, a dark speck riding the thermals. Yet, the hair on his nape lifted. The air felt charged, watchful. He reined in the horses just before the shallow ford, letting them dip their muzzles into the cold, clear water. The Runaways remained utterly still. He climbed down stiffly, his boots crunching on the gravelly bank. He needed water for the horses, maybe to fill his canteen, and perhaps a moment away from the suffocating mystery in the wagon. He knelt by the creek, the cold water numbing his fingers as he scooped it over the horses' dusty necks. The rhythmic splashing was the only sound besides the creek's gentle murmur and the wind soughing through the pines. Then, a rustle from the wagon. He froze, water dripping from his hand. One of the figures shifted. Not the speaker, but the one beside her. Taller, broader in the shoulder. A tension radiated from her, a coiled readiness utterly unlike the other's fearful stillness. Elias slowly straightened, his hand drifting instinctively towards a bone-handled Colt holstered at his hip. He watched, every nerve taut. The tall woman tilted her hooded head, not towards him, but slightly upstream. A deliberate gesture. Then, slowly, deliberately, she lifted her bound hands towards her hood, fingers twitching as if yearning to tear it off, yet stopping just short. It wasn't a plea for release. It was a signal, a warning. Elias followed the direction of her hooded gaze, scanning the darkening tree line upstream where the creek emerged from pines. His breath hitched. There, faint against the deep indigo shadows beneath the trees. Not movement, but an absence of movement. A shape too solid, too angular to be rock or stump. The silhouette of a man, sitting perfectly still on horseback, watching the crossing. Watching him. The horse stood like a statue, head down. The rider was a mere cutout of deeper shadow against the gloom, featureless, anonymous, yet radiating a chilling intent. How long had he been there? Waiting? Elias's blood turned to ice water. The auctioneer's leering face flashed in his mind. Runaways, trouble, take your pick. Trouble had found him faster than he'd ever imagined. The pursuers weren't distant rumors. They were here, breathing the same cold air, watching his every move. The fragile refuge of his ranch suddenly felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. He had 5 vulnerable souls relying on him, one of whom held a shard of his broken past, and a shadow on a ridge who held their future in his hands. The whisper of his name now felt like a death knell echoing in the vast, indifferent wilderness. He had to get them across the creek, into the dubious safety of the cabin walls. But the eyes in the trees promised the journey wasn't over. The night was just beginning, and it would be long and cold and fraught with peril. The wagon, his burden of mercy, had become a beacon for wolves. The silhouette in the pines didn't move. It simply was a dark punctuation mark against the deepening twilight beneath the trees, a silent assertion of menace that froze the breath in Elias's lungs. The creek's gentle murmur suddenly sounded like the low growl of a predator. The tall Runaway's hooded head remained tilted upstream, her bound hands frozen in that abortive gesture towards her sack, a warning delivered without a word. Trouble. Here. Now. Every instinct screamed to flee, to whip the horses into a frenzy, to charge across the creek and bolt the dubious sanctuary of the cabin. But flight was noise, movement, a beacon. The watcher hadn't acted. Yet, perhaps observation was his only task. Or perhaps he was a scout, and others waited unseen. Elias forced himself to breathe, slow and deep, the cold air scraping his throat. He couldn't panic. 5 lives, hooded and bound, depended on his next move being measured, deliberate. 5 lives, and the ghost of name whispered in the dust. He finished watering the horses with deliberate calm, his movements unhurried, his back a shield to the unseen eyes. He filled his canteen, the icy water biting his fingers, a grounding sensation. When he climbed back onto the wagon bench, he didn't glance towards the pines. He gathered the reins, his voice low and steady, pitched only for the horses. Easy now. Walk on. He clicked his tongue. The wagon lurched forward into the shallow ford, water swirling around the wheels, cold spray misting the air. Elias kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, on the dark shape of the cabin across the clearing, but his entire being was focused on the ridge, on the stillness of that shadow rider. He felt exposed, a beetle crossing a bare stone under a hawk's gaze. The Runaways huddled lower, a collective flinch as the water surged. They reached the far bank. The wagon creaked up the gentle incline towards the cabin yard. Only when the bulk of the barn began to obscure the view upstream did Elias allow himself a swift, sidelong look. The ridge was empty. The shadow was gone, vanished as silently as it had appeared. The relief was cold and thin, instantly soured by the knowledge. They were seen. They were known. The fragile distance he'd hoped to put between the Runaways and their past had evaporated before he'd even crossed his own creek. Whispering Pines was no longer a refuge. It was a stage set for violence. He drove the wagon directly into barn, the dim interior smelling of old hay, dust, and the sharp tang of liniment. The Runaways remained motionless, spectral figures in the gloom. Elias dismounted, his boots loud on the packed earth floor. He moved quickly, securing the barn door from the inside with a heavy timber bar. Only then did he turn to face them, the weight of their silent expectation pressing on him like stone. "We're inside," he said, his voice rough. "For now. But they're out there. Saw one." He paused, the image of the hooded woman's warning gesture vivid. "The tall one. You saw him too. Who is he?" Silence, thick and suffocating. Only the shifting of a horse in its stall and the frantic drumming of Elias's own heart broke the quiet. He stepped closer to the wagon bed. The burlap sacks were identical, anonymous, yet his eyes were drawn inexorably to the smallest figure, the one whose whisper had shattered his solitude. "You," he said, his voice dropping lower, rougher. "You spoke my name. Back at the crossing. Why? Who are you?" He reached out, his hand hovering near the rough fabric covering her head. The impulse to tear it off, to confront the ghost face to face, was almost overwhelming, but fear held him back. Fear what he might see, fear what tearing away that anonymity might unleash. "You know me. How?" A tremor ran through her. A faint, choked sound escaped the sack, not words, but a stifled sob. The figure beside her, the tall one who had signaled, shifted slightly, a subtle movement that felt protective, shielding. Still, no words came from beneath the hoods. Frustration wore with the cold dread coiling in his gut. He couldn't force them, not like they had been forced. The memory of the auction block, the leering faces, the casual cruelty, it curdled his stomach. He'd bought them to escape that, not perpetuate it. He turned away, running a hand over his face, the stubble rough against his palm. Cora, her face swam before him, not the pale, fevered ghost of her last days, but the vibrant woman she'd been, her smile like sunlight on the high meadows. She possessed a fierce compassion, a light that had drawn people, that had filled their home. What would she have done? She wouldn't have left them hooded in a dark barn. He turned back. "I'm going to take the sacks off," he stated, his voice firmer now. "No one's touching you. I need to see. We need to see each other." He drew the bone-handled knife from his belt. The rasp of steel, leaving leather was loud. A collective intake of breath came from the wagon. He saw the tall woman tense, her bound hands clenching into fists. He moved slowly, deliberately, telegraphing his actions. He stepped to the tailgate and reached for the sack on the nearest figure. Not the speaker, not the tall one, but another, slumped and trembling. The rough burlap scraped under his fingers. He gently lifted it away. The face revealed was gaunt, etched with exhaustion and fear. A woman perhaps in her 30s, her dark hair matted, her eyes wide and haunted, darting around the shadowed barn like a trapped animal. She flinched away from his gaze, pressing herself against the wagon's side. Elias felt a fresh wave of shame and anger. He moved to the next, then the next, removing the sacks with careful hands. Two more faces emerged, one younger, barely more than a girl, her cheeks tear-streaked and dirty, another older, her expression closed and wary, lines of hardship deep around her mouth. Each flinch, each terrified glance, was a lash against his conscience. They were broken things, souls scraped raw. He came to the tall woman. She didn't flinch. As he lifted the sack, she met his gaze directly. Her face was strong-boned, striking rather than beautiful, framed by dark, tightly braided hair. A fading bruise mottled her left cheekbone, and her eyes were a startling, clear gray, holding not just fear, but a fierce intelligence and a simmering anger. She assessed him coolly, her gaze sweeping from his worn boots to his tense face. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod as the sack came off. Acknowledgement? Warning? He couldn't tell. Finally, he stood before the smallest figure, the one who had spoken his name. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the coarse fabric. He hesitated, the echo of that whisper, "Elias?" resonating in the quiet barn. He took a breath and lifted the sack. The face beneath was young, heartbreakingly so. Delicate features, pale skin smudged with dirt in the grime of the sack, framed by a tangle of weak gold hair that caught the faint light filtering through the barn's cracks. Her eyes, wide in the deep blue of mountain gentians, met his, and in them, Elias saw not just fear, but a dawning, agonizing recognition that mirrored his own confusion. He stared, searching the contours of her face, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her jaw. He knew this face. He knew it. But from where? Not Cora, not Michael. The connection danced just beyond his grasp, maddeningly elusive, like a half-remembered dream. She was perhaps 17, 18, too young to be from the life he'd lived before the silence descended. Yet the familiarity was a physical ache. "Who are you?" he breathed, the words barely audible. Her lips parted. She swallowed, her throat working. You don't remember?" Her voice was a thread, husky with disuse and fear, but undeniably the same that had spoken his name. It held a tremor of disbelief, a hint of crushing disappointment. Before he could respond, before the elusive memory could surface, the tall woman spoke, her voice low and urgent, cutting through the tension. "Names can wait, rancher. Water. And light. They'll come with the dark." Her gray eyes flicked towards a barred barn door. He wasn't alone. The practicality of her words jolted Elias back to the immediate peril. Names and ghosts could wait. Survival couldn't. He nodded curtly. "Right. Inside the cabin. Now, stay close." He cut the remaining bonds on their wrists with swift strokes of his knife. the sharp snick of the blade severing the rough rope echoing in confined space. The women rubbed their freed wrists, the younger ones whimpering softly. The tall woman helped the speaker down from the wagon, her touch surprisingly gentle on the girl's arm. Elias led them quickly across the moonlit yard, his senses straining against the night. The Bitterroot Peaks were silver-edged monoliths against the star-strewn sky, beautiful and indifferent. Frost was already glittering on the sparse grass like scattered diamonds, crunching underfoot. The cabin door groaned open, revealing the sparse interior. A stone hearth holding cold ashes, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a cot against the far wall, and shelves holding meager supplies. The air was stale, cold, heavy with years of solitude. He lit a tin lantern, its yellow flame casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to crowd the small space. "Bar the door once I'm out," he instructed the tall woman, handing her the heavy timber bar. Her gray eyes met his, a flicker of understanding passing between them. He saw no malice there, only a grim determination. "I need to check the creek, see what else they might have done." He slipped back out into the biting cold, closing the door behind him. He heard the solid thunk of the bar falling into place. Good. He moved like a shadow himself, keeping to the deeper pools of darkness cast by the cabin and barn, his Colt revolver now drawn and cold in his hand. The moonlight painted the clearing in stark blacks and silvers. He circled wide, approaching the creek crossing from downstream, using the bank and the rustling sagebrush for cover. The water glinted, a ribbon of liquid mercury in the night. He saw it immediately, near the spot where he'd knelt to water the horses. The bank was disturbed, not just hoof prints, deeper gouges, as if something heavy had been dragged. His gut clenched. He crouched low, scanning the opposite bank, the tree line. Nothing moved. Cautiously, he moved closer to the disturbed earth. The stench hit him first, a sour, cloying smell that turned his stomach. Carrion, rot. He peered into the shallow water at the edge. Wedged between 2 rocks, partially submerged, lay the swollen, stiffening carcass of a coyote. It hadn't died naturally. Its belly was slit open, entrails spilling like dark ropes into the clear water, already clouding it downstream. Flies, dormant in the cold, clustered thickly on the mess. It was a deliberate act, vile, a message. We poisoned your water. We defiled your sanctuary. We are here and we are ruthless. Rage, cold and sharp, surged through Elias, momentarily eclipsing his fear. This was the work of animals. No, animals kill for food or defense. This was the work of men who reveled in cruelty, who used terror as a weapon. His creek, Silver Creek, the lifeblood of Whispering Pines. The water core had love for its clarity, befouled. The fragile sense of sanctuary he'd offered the Runaways felt like a sick joke. He'd backed away, keeping low. They couldn't stay. Not now. The cabin was a trap, the water tainted. But where could he take 5 exhausted, terrified women in the dead of night, with hunters close on their trail? The vast, indifferent wilderness offered no answers, only deeper peril. He was almost back to the cabin yard when he saw it, nailed crudely to the trunk of the lone cottonwood tree near the cabin door, the tree under which Cora and Michael slept their endless sleep. Something pale fluttered against the dark bark. A piece of paper? No. As he drew closer, the moonlight revealed it. A crude doll, made of sticks bound with twine, dressed in a ragged scrap of calico that might once have been part of a child's dress. It hung by a loop of wire around its neck. A chill colder than the Wyoming night seeped into Elias's bones. It wasn't just a threat. It was a mockery, a desecration. They knew about the graves. They knew about Michael. He ripped the grotesque thing from the tree, the wire biting into his fingers. He crushed the crude figure in his fist, the brittle sticks snapping. Fury warred with a terror deeper than any he'd known since Cora's last breath. He looked toward the cabin, a low, dark shape against the stars. Inside were 5 women relying on him. one carrying a ghost from his past he couldn't name, and outside were monsters who knew his deepest wounds and delighted in prodding them. He took a step toward the cabin, the crushed doll still clutched in his fist. Then he froze. A sound sliced through the night stillness. Not an owl, not the wind. A low, mournful whistle. 3 short notes, rising in pitch, then falling away. It came from the ridge north of the cabin, the direction of the high pass. A signal, cold, deliberate, and then, faint but distinct, an answering whistle echoed from the trees downstream, near the befouled creek. They were closing the net. Whispering Pines was surrounded. The fragile bar on the cabin door suddenly felt as thin as paper. The night held its breath, waiting for the knife to fall. The answering whistle hung in the frigid air, a serpent's hiss coiling around the cabin. Elias stood rooted, the crushed remnants of the vile doll digging into his palm like shards of bone. They knew about Michael. The thought was a fresh wound, deeper and more violating than the poisoned creek. The whistles weren't just signals. They were coordinates, pinning Whispering Pines on a map drawn by Malice. North Ridge, downstream. The net was drawn tight. He moved. Instinct, honed by years of solitude and the sudden, crushing weight of responsibility, propelled him. He flung the mangled doll aside, a gesture of futile defiance against the desecration. The cabin door felt like the lid of a tomb as he hammered on it. A sharp, urgent rhythm. Open. It's me. The heavy timber bar scraped inside. The door swung inward just enough for him to slip through, and Brenna, the tall woman with the fierce gray eyes, slammed it shut behind him, heaving the bar back into place with a solid thunk. The meager light from the tin lantern painted harsh lines on the faces of the women huddled near the coal hearth. The younger ones trembled, arms wrapped tightly around themselves. The older woman, Martha, stared into the shadows with a grim resignation. The speaker, the girl with the corn silk hair and eyes like mountain gentians, flinched as he entered, her gaze darting fearfully to his empty hands. "They're out there," Elias stated, his voice low and gravelly. He didn't need to elaborate. The whistles had spoken for him. He saw the knowledge register in Brenna's sharp eyes. The tightening of Martha's jaw signaled each other. North Ridge and downstream. They fouled the creek upstream, poised in a carcass, waters tainted. He saw the speaker's face pale further, a whimper escaping her lips. He couldn't bring himself to mention the doll. Not yet, not in front of the grave's silent witnesses. Brenna nodded curtly. "We heard the whistles. What now? We can't drink the creek. Can't stay holed up forever." Her practicality was a stark anchor in the rising tide of panic. Elias scanned the sparse cabin. Years of self-imposed isolation meant meager defenses. "Windows," he said, moving toward the nearest one, a small, square opening shutter from the inside with rough planks. "Barred, but flimsy. Need weight." He started dragging the heavy wooden table towards the door, adding its bulk to the timber bar. Brenna understood immediately, helping him muscle into place. Martha, with surprising strength for her worn frame, began pushing a chair against the shuttered window beside the hearth. The younger women, spurred by the sudden activity, joined in, dragging sacks of grain and Elias's own meager trunk to bolster the other window and the door, a fragile barricade against an unknown number. As they worked, Elias found himself beside the speaker, struggling to lift a sack of oats. Her small hands fumbled, her strength sapped by fear and exhaustion. Without a word, he took the weight from her, his hand brushing hers. She recoiled momentarily, then met his eyes. That flicker of agonizing recognition was still there, mixed now with a desperate confusion. "Who are you?" The question screamed silently between them. "Here," he said gruffly, pushing the sack into place. "Lean against it." She nodded mutely, pressing her thin shoulder against the rough burlap, her blue eyes wide and fixed on the shuttered window, as if she could see the hunters beyond. He remembered Cora, not in her final sickness, but years before, her face alight with fierce protectiveness the day a lone wolf had ventured too close to corral where young Michael toddled. She'd snatched up a hoe, placing herself between the child and the predator, her voice ringing clear and unafraid. This far, no further. The echo of her courage burned in his chest now. He wasn't protecting a child, but he was protecting lives, broken lives entrusted to him by a cruel twist of fate. And one of them held a piece of his past, a key he couldn't yet turn. The barricade was as solid as they could make it. The lantern's flame guttered, casting long, leaping shadows that seemed to mock their efforts. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy, broken only by the ragged breathing of the women and the mournful sigh of the wind in the eaves. Elias checked the cylinder of his Colt. The cold metal familiar comfort. He had a rifle above the hearth. Loaded, it felt pitifully inadequate. "We need water," Martha stated flatly, her voice cracking. "Ain't had a proper drink since before." Elias nodded. He'd forgotten the small rain barreled near the back corner of the cabin, collecting runoff from the roof. It wouldn't be much, and likely stale, but it was untainted. He dipped a tin cup into the murky water, offering it first to the speaker. Her hands shook as she took it, sipping cautiously, then gulping thirstily. As she lowered the cup, her fingers brushed against the neckline of her worn dress, catching on something hidden beneath the fabric. A flicker of silver caught the lantern light. Elias's gaze sharpened. Hanging from a thin, worn leather cord around her neck was a small, tarnished locket. It was a simple oval, perhaps silver once, etched with a faded floral pattern he couldn't quite make out. His breath hitched. He knew that locket, not the pattern, but the shape, the weight of it in his mind's eye. Cora had owned one like it. A matching pair, given to sisters, friends? He couldn't recall. Cora had rarely worn hers, saying it pinched, but he'd seen it in her keepsake box, nestled beside a lock of Michael's hair. The speaker saw him staring. Her hand flew to the locket, clutching protectively, her eyes wide with sudden panic. "That locket," Elias began, his voice rough with the effort of keeping it low. "Where did you get it?" She flinched, pressing the small silver disc against her skin as if it could shield her. Tears welled in her blue eyes. I've always had it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Since I was small. My guardian gave it to me, said it was for protection." Her brow furrowed, a flicker of pain crossing her features. She had dark hair, kind eyes. She smelled like lavender and sunshine. Her voice broke on the last word. Lavender. Cora had grown lavender by the doorstep, crushing it between her fingers to release its scent. A wave of dizziness washed over Elias. This girl, barely more than a child, remembered Cora? As a guardian? It made no sense. Cora had never mentioned, unless the lost years after Michael's death were a blur of grief. Had Cora, in her own sorrow, reached out to someone, taken in a child? The timing was wrong. This girl was too young. Unless a relative? A niece he'd never known about? The fragmented memories offered no answers, only deeper confusion and a terrifying sense of connection. He needed to see inside that locket. Before he could ask, Brenna hissed, a sharp intake of breath. "Listen!" They all froze. Beyond the wind, beyond the creak of the cabin timbers, came a new sound. Faint at first, then unmistakable. The rhythmic chink of a horse's bridle, the soft crunch of boots on frost-hardened earth. Circling, close, too close, near the barn. Elias motioned sharply for silence. He moved like a ghost to the shuttered window nearest the barn, easing aside a tiny sliver of the sack-covered grain blocking it to peer through a crack in the plank shutter. The moonlight cast the yard in monochrome. Frost glittered on the sparse grass like a scattering of shattered glass. He scanned the shadows near the barn, his heart hammering against his ribs. There, a figure detached itself from the deeper gloom beside the barn's corner. A man broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He moved with a deliberate, predatory slowness, scanning the cabin, the yard, the barricaded door. He carried a rifle loosely in one hand. Elias recognized the build, the posture. This wasn't the shadow rider from Ridge. This was someone else, a foot soldier in the hunting party. The man paused, looking directly toward Elias's peephole, as if sensing the weight of his gaze. A cruel smile split the shadowed face beneath the hat brim. He raised his free hand, not in threat, but in a mocking, slow wave. Then he deliberately turned and kicked over the tin bucket Elias used for the horses, the metallic clang echoing like a gunshot in the silent night. The message was clear. We see you. We're coming. The man melted back into the shadows near the barn, but Elias's gaze snagged on something else, a flicker of orange light, deep within the barn itself. A tiny, growing flame licking hungrily at the dry hay piled near the stall where the horses were tethered. He left a kerosene lantern hanging on a hook inside. Sabotage. They weren't just surrounding them. They were trying to smoke them out, trap them, burn them alive. Panic, cold and sharp, stabbed through him. Fire. Elias rasped, whirling from the window. The barn. They've set the barn alight. Gasps filled the cabin. The speaker cried out, a sound of pure terror. Brenna's face hardened into grim resolve. The horses, they'll panic, burn. The implications crashed over Elias. The horses trapped, screaming, the fire spreading toward the cabin. The hunters waiting to pick them off as they fled the flames. It was a death sentence. He couldn't let the animals burn. And without the horses, any hope of escape vanished. He grabbed his rifle from above the hearth, racking the lever with a sharp clack-clack. Stay down. Bar the door after me, he ordered Brenna. I have to cut the horses loose. It's our only chance. He couldn't let Cora's memory be consumed by fire, not again. Not while he had breath. You'll be shot, Martha protested, her voice thick with fear. They're waiting for that, Brenna said, her gray eyes meeting Elias's. Understanding passed between them. The fire was a diversion. The trap sprung, but the horses were vital. I'll cover this window. Go fast. Elias didn't hesitate. He threw off the timber bar and hauled the heavy table aside just enough to wrench the door open. Cold air and the acrid scent of smoke rushed in. He plunged into the moonlit yard, rifle at the ready, sprinting low towards the barn. Behind him, he heard the door slam shut, the bar thudding back into place. The orange glow from within the barn was brighter now, painting the cracks in the planking with flickering light. He could hear the terrified screams of the horses, the crackle of hungry flames. He reached the barn door, fumbling with the heavy latch. As he yanked it open, a wave of heat and smoke billowed out, stinging his eyes. The scene inside was chaos. Flames danced along the hay pile, reaching for the rafters. The two horses reared and plunged against their tethers, eyes rolling white with terror. Elias ducked low, coughing, his eyes streaming. He lunged to the nearest horse, fumbling for the rope halter tie. The heat was intense, the smoke choking. He got the first rope free. The horse bolted past him, a blur of panic, straight out into the moonlit yard, neighing wildly. Elias turned to the second horse, its coat slick with sweat, its breath coming in terrified snorts. He grabbed the knot, his fingers clumsy with urgency and smoke. As he worked it loose, a movement caught his eye from the corner of the barn door. The broad-shouldered man stood silhouetted against the moonlight, rifle raised. Elias froze, caught in the open doorway, bathed in the hellish light of the burning barn. The man didn't fire immediately. He took a step closer, his cruel smile visible now in the flickering light. "Evening, Holt," he called out, his voice a rough drawl laced with malice. "Boss sends his regards. Says you got something he wants back. Reckon we'll take it off your ashes." He raised the rifle, taking deliberate aim. Elias dropped flat as the shot cracked, the bullet whining past his ear and splintering behind him. He rolled desperately, bringing his own rifle up, firing blindly towards the silhouette. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt near the man's boots. The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound, and moved sideways, seeking better cover. Inside the barn, the flames roared higher, consuming the dry timber. The remaining horse screamed, a sound of pure agony, as a burning rafter crashed down near its stall. Elias scrambled to his feet, driven by the animal's terror and the need to get back to the cabin. He fired again toward the shadow where the gunman had been, then turned and sprinted, coughing, back toward the cabin door. "Open up!" he roared, slamming his shoulder against the wood. The bar scraped. The door opened a fraction. He tumbled inside, Brenna slamming it shut and rebarring it instantly. He collapsed against the wall, gasping for clean air, his face smudged with soot, the stench of smoke clinging to him. One horse was free, lost in the night. The other, he closed his eyes, the dying scream echoing in his mind. The barn was inferno now, casting flickering, monstrous shadows through the cabin's cracks, illuminating the terrified faces of the women. "They're coming now," Brenna stated, peering through a crack and shutter. Her voice was grim, using the light. 2, no, 3 men, moving in from the barn side. The speaker, her face pale as milk, stumbled toward Elias. Her hand went to lock it again, her fingers fumbling with the tiny catch. With trembling hands, she pressed it into his soot-blackened palm. "Take it," she whispered, her voice raw with terror and something else, a desperate plea. If they get me, please. It's all I have of her. Of Cora." She fumbled with the catch, opening the locket with a tiny snick. Inside, pressed against a faded scrap of blue fabric, was a single word etched in tiny, delicate script on the inner curve of the silver. Elara. Elara. The name struck him like a physical blow. He stared at the inscription, then at her face, the gentian blue eyes wide with fear and a dawning, desperate hope. Elara. It resonated. A faint chime in the deepest vault of his memory, drowned for years beneath the flood of grief. Cora's voice, soft and wistful, whispering a name long ago, a secret sorrow a child given away? Before Michael? The connection shimmered, terrifying and elusive. Before he could grasp it, before he could ask, a thunderous blow shook the cabin door. Then another. Splinters flew from the heavy timber as an axe bit deep into the wood. A harsh voice, the same one that had taunted him by the barn, roared from outside, "Open up, halt! Time's up. Hand over the girl and the others, and maybe we let you burn quick." The firelight from the burning barn painted the axe blade as it rose again, a gleaming arc of destruction against the shuddering door. The fragile barricade groaned under the assault. The net wasn't just drawn tight, it was collapsing around them. Elias clutched the open lock in his fist, the name Elara burning against his skin as the axe fell again. The past and the present were converging in a storm of fire and violence, and the door wouldn't hold much longer. The axe blow struck the door like a thunderclap, shuddering the timbers and sending a shower of splinters into the smoke-hazed air of the cabin. The cruel voice outside roared again, "Hand over the girl, halt, or we'll carve our way in and take the lot." Another massive thud followed, the axe blade biting deeper, a gleam of murderous intent visible through the widening crack. Elias reacted instantly, shoving the open locket, the name Elara burning against his palm, into his pocket. He raised his rifle. He didn't aim for the crack. He aimed low, toward the boots he imagined beneath it. He fired. The report was deafening in the confined space. A curse sounded outside, followed by a stumble and the clatter of the axe hitting the porch planks. A momentary reprieve. "Brenna, rifle, cover the windows." Elias barked, levering a fresh round into the chamber. His voice was raw, stripped of everything but command. The firelight from the burning barn painted frantic, leaping shadows on the walls, turning the cabin into a flickering hellscape. The air grew thick with smoke and the smell of fear. Brenna snatched a rifle from its pegs above the hearth, her movement swift and sure. She positioned herself at the shuttered window Elias had peered from earlier, easing aside a sack to create a narrow, firing slit. Her gray eyes were chips of ice, scanning the firelit yard. Martha herded the two younger women, wide-eyed and trembling, into the farthest corner, pressing them down behind Elias's overturned trunk. The speaker, Ilara, remained frozen near Elias, her gaze fixed on the splintered door, her hand unconsciously clutching the spot where the locket had lain. "They'll flank," Brenna stated flatly, her voice cutting through the horse's dying screams from the inferno outside. Fire's lighting us up like a beacon. As if summoned by her words, a shot cracked from the direction of the creek. A bullet punched through the plank shutter near Brenna's head, showering her with fragments. She didn't flinch. She returned fire, a sharp, economical movement. A grunt sounded outside, followed by the thud of a body hitting the ground. One less, but more would come. Elias risked a glance through the widening crack in the door. The broad-shouldered man who had taunted him by the barn was crouched behind the water trough, reloading a pistol. Another figure darted from the cover of the smoldering barn ruins toward the cabin side. Elias fired, forcing the runner to dive for cover behind the rain barrel. The man behind the trough laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Stubborn fool, halt! You're outgunned and surrounded. Silas Cade don't take kindly to thieves stealing his property." Silas Cade. The name meant nothing to Elias, a fresh layer of dread settling over him. This wasn't random cruelty. This was targeted, led by someone named, and they wanted the Runaways back. Property. The word curdled his blood. He turned to the speaker, his voice urgent but low. "Ilara?" The name felt foreign, heavy on his tongue. "Is that you? Your name?" Her eyes snapped to his, filled with terror and a flicker of desperate hope. She gave a tiny, frantic nod. "Why? Why does Cade want you? What are you to him?" Tears streamed down her soot-streaked face. I don't know. Not like the others. He kept me separate. Said I was special. That I belonged somewhere else. But he hurt us, Her words dissolved into choked sobs, her small frame racked with terror. The locket, the connection to Cora, was that why she was special? The thought was a chilling possibility. Another axe blow slammed into the door, lower this time, near the latch. The timber groaned. Elias fired again through the crack, forcing the axeman back momentarily. Brenna fired from the window, her shot answered by two more from the yard. One shattered the lantern hanging near the hearth. It crashed to the floor, oil spreading, flames instantly licking hungrily across the dry wood planks. "Fire!" Martha screamed, scrambling back as the flames leapt toward the sacks of grain stacked near the window. Panic surged. They were being burned out, trapped between the fire outside and the fire within. Elias stamped desperately at the spreading flames with his boot, but the oil fed it quickly. Smoke billowed, thicker now, acrid and stinging. "Root cellar." Brenna yelled, coughing. She pointed towards a worn rug near the back wall, partially hidden by the cot. Saw the ring pull. "Go!" Elias didn't hesitate. He kicked aside the rug, revealing a heavy iron ring set into a trapdoor. He hauled it open, revealing a yawning black pit and a crude ladder leading down. Damp, earthy air wafted up, a stark contrast to the thickening smoke. "Down! All of you! Now!" he ordered. Martha didn't need telling twice. She pushed the two younger women toward the opening. "Go! Quick!" They scrambled down the ladder into the darkness. Martha followed. Brenna fired one last shot out the window, then grabbed Ilara's arm, pulling her towards the cellar. The girl resisted for a split second, her terrified eyes fixed on Elias. "Come with us." "Go!" Elias roared, stamping at the flames that were now climbing the wall beside the door. "I'll hold them." Brenna practically shoved Ilara down the ladder, then followed, her gray eyes locking with Elias's for a fleeting moment. A look that held no fear, only fierce resolve. She pulled the heavy trapdoor shut behind her with a solid thump, plunging the cellar entrance back into near darkness, save for the flickering light of the fire now consuming part of the cabin wall. Elias was alone. Smoke choked him, Flames crackled along the wall, reaching for the rafters. The axe blows resumed on the door, more frantic now, sensing weakness. He backed toward the trapdoor, rifle ready, eyes watering, scanning the shuddering door and the windows where muzzle flashes still sporadically lit the night. He had to give them time to get clear. Time to do what? Where could they go from a root cellar? A section of the door near the latch finally gave way with a splintering crash. The broad-shouldered man, his face a mass of sweat and soot beneath his hat, shoved his way through the gap, pistol raised. Elias fired. The man jerked sideways as the bullet grazed his arm, but he didn't go down. He fired wildly into the smoky interior. Elias felt the wind of the bullet pass his cheek. He levered another round, but the man lunged, not at Elias, but toward the burning wall. He kicked fiercely at the base of the flames, scattering burning debris toward the center of the room, trying to cut off Elias's retreat to the cellar. "Cade wants a girl alive, halt!" The man snarled, dodging another shot from Elias. "You?" he said, "dead or alive?" "Prefers dead." He fired again, the bullet thudding into the timber frame near Elias's head. Elias knew he couldn't hold. The fire was spreading, the smoke blinding. More men would pour through the broken door any second. He had to get to the cellar. He fired one last shot, forcing the man to duck behind the overturned table, then turned and sprinted for the trapdoor. He yanked the ring pull, the heavy door groaning open. As he turned to drop down, the broad-shouldered man rose, pistol aiming steadily. A shot rang out, but not from the man's pistol. It came from outside, from the darkness near the creek. The broad-shouldered man jerked violently, a look of profound surprise on his face. He dropped his pistol, clutched his chest, and crumpled to the burning floor. Elias didn't wait to see who fired the saving shot. He plunged down the ladder, pulling the trapdoor shut above him just as another figure appeared in the shattered doorway. He dropped the last few feet into the cool, damp darkness of the cellar. Above, the sounds of shouting, more gunfire, and the hungry roar of the fire intensified. It was pitch black. He could hear ragged breathing nearby. "Here!" Brenna's voice came, low and close. A match flared, illuminating her grim face and the frightened eyes of the others huddled in the small, earthen-walled space. Shelves lined with dusty jars of preserves lined one wall. The air smelled of damp earth, roots, and fear. "They shot him!" Elias gasped, leaning against a cool earth wall, trying to catch his breath. "One of their own? Or wasn't them?" Brenna said, blowing out the match, plunging them back into darkness. The sound of chaos continued above. Came from the creek side. Different rifle sound. Sharper. A new player. Elias's mind reeled. Friend or foe? Someone drawn by the fire? Another hunter? The cellar felt less like a refuge and more like a tomb. They were trapped, blind, while a battle raged over their heads and their sanctuary burned. Ilara's hand found his arm in the dark, trembling. "Elias," her whisper was barely audible. "The locket, did you see?" He remembered the weight in his pocket. He fumbled for it, the cool metal a strange comfort. In the chaos, he hadn't looked beyond the name. He pulled it out, the tiny hinge creaking faintly as he opened again in the absolute blackness. He couldn't see, but he traced the inside with his fingertip, the worn leather cord, the faded scrap of blue fabric, and then, beneath the fabric, tucked into the very back of the tiny compartment, his finger brushed against something else. Not metal, paper, thin, folded paper. His breath caught. He carefully pried it out, a tiny, fragile square. He handed the locket back to Ilara, clutching the paper tightly. Brenna struck another match. In the sudden, flaring light, Elias unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. It was brittle, yellow with age, covered in faded, looping script written in dark brown ink. He recognized the handwriting instantly. Cora's. The match guttered out, but not before Elias had seen the opening words, seared into his mind by the brief flare. "My dearest Elias, if you are reading this, The worst has come to pass, and Alara has found her way to you. The match died. Darkness swallowed them again, deeper and more profound than before. Above, the roar of the fire was a constant, hungry growl, punctuated by sporadic gunfire and shouts. But Elias heard none of it. The words echoed in the silent vault as grief and shock. If you are reading this, the worst has come to pass. Cora had written this for him, about Alara, a secret carried to the grave, now thrust into his hand in a burning cellar beneath their ruined home. The past wasn't just echoing, it was screaming, and the fragile hope of understanding who Alara was and why Cora had hidden her existence was trapped in his fist with the fading warmth of the match. While the world burned above them, he clutched the tiny letter, the unread words a crushing weight and a desperate lifeline, as the thunder of collapsing timbers shook the earth above their heads. The thunder above wasn't skyborn. It was the agonized groan of whispering pines collapsing in on itself. Each crash sent tremors to the root cellar's earthen floor, raining fine dirt onto the huddled figures below. Smoke, thick and acrid, seeped through the cracks around the trapdoor, coiling in the suffocating darkness like a living thing. The roar of the fire was a constant, hungry beast devouring Elias's past, his present, his sanctuary. In his fist, clutched so tightly the edges bit into his palm, was a fragile square of paper, Cora's final hidden word. Brenna struck another match. The tiny flame flared, revealing faces etched with terror and soot. Martha's grim stoicism, the two younger women clinging to each other, eyes wide and unseeing, Brenna's fierce gray gaze scanning the cellar walls as if seeking an escape route, and Alara, her corn silk hair matted, her blue eyes fixed on Elias, shimmering with a desperate, unspoken question. The matchlight guttered over the faded script. "Read it," Alara whispered, her voice raw from smoke and tears. "Please, before the fire found them, before the hunters broke through, before the earth above became their tomb." Elias nodded, the movement stiff. He angled the brittle paper toward the dying matchlight, his eyes straining. Cora's familiar, looping handwriting, usually filled with warmth or list for the ranch, now spoke with chilling, prophetic gravity. "My dearest Elias, if you are reading this, the worst has come to pass, and Alara has found her way to you. My heart breaks to think of the grief that must surround you for this letter to be opened. Forgive me, my love, for the secret I carried, a burden too heavy to share, born of fear and a sister's broken heart. Alara is my niece. My sister, Lena, married Silas Cade against our family's wishes, drawn by his charm that hid a viper's soul. When Lena died in childbirth, a death Cade's neglect surely hastened. He saw only the inheritance she held in trust of the babe, land rich in timber along the Medicine Bow. He wanted it, Elias. He wanted it unencumbered. He meant to dispose of the child. I couldn't let him. I took Alara that terrible night, fled south under cover of storm, and placed her with distant kin near Laramie. Good people sworn to secrecy, raising her as their own. I gave her the locket, mine and Lena's, twin lockets our mother gave us. Lena's was lost, but mine held this truth. I told them to give it to her only if I died, or if Cade ever found her and they had to send her away. Cade hunts her still, I fear. He believes the land rights died with Lena, but the deed requires Alara's survival to pass unbroken. If she dies, it reverts to the territory. He wants her dead, Elias, or worse, found in silence, his claim secured. He is ruthless, driven by greed like a sickness. Protect her, my love, as I know your heart, broken as it is, still holds the strength of mountains. She is Lena's daughter, my blood. She is the last piece of my heart outside of you and our sweet Michael. Keep her safe. Find a way. All my love. Always. Cora." The match died. Darkness slammed down, absolute and crushing. Elias's breath hitched, a ragged sound in the silence that followed the letter's final, whispered truth. My niece, Lena's daughter, Cade's child. The implications crashed over him. The depth of Cora's secret, the weight of her trust, the monstrous nature of the man hunting them. Silas Cade wasn't just a slaver or brute. He was a father seeking his daughter's death for timber rights. The desecration at the graves, the poisoned creek, the burning barn. It was all part of his calculated cruelty. Ilara wasn't just a runaway. She was a key to wealth, and her survival threatened Cade's claim. A small, cold hand found us in the dark. Ilara's. She trembled violently. Aunt Cora? She breathed. The words choked. She saved me? From him? The horror in her voice was palpable. The man who had kept her separate, who had hinted she was special, was her own father, her would-be murderer. Her world, already shattered, collapsed into a deeper, more terrible abyss. Yes, Elias rasped, squeezing her hand, the gesture feeling alien yet necessary. She saved you, and she trusted me to keep you safe. The responsibility settled on his shoulders, heavier than any wagon load, yet strangely anchoring. It wasn't just mercy now, it was blood. It was Cora's final plea. We can't stay. Brenna's voice cut through the emotional maelstrom, sharp with urgency. The crashing above had lessened, replaced by the crackle of intense burning. The air grew hotter, thicker with smoke. They'll dig down, or the fire will bake us alive. Is there another way out? Elias forced his mind to focus, past the echo of Cora's words, past the horror on Ilara's face. The cellar. Cora had insisted on it. Deep and cool, dug near the creek bank for drainage. He remembered her pointing out the back wall once, years ago, joking about needing an escape route from his cooking. The back wall, he said, coughing. Cora, she had me shore up extra strong near the creek bank. Said it was against flooding. But maybe he stumbled forward in the pitch black, hands outstretched, feeling the cool, packed earth. He moved left, toward the rear corner of the small space, away from the ladder. His fingers brushed rough timber, not shelves, but vertical beams reinforcing the wall. He traced them down. Near the floor, the earth felt different, looser, damp. Here, he hissed. Help me. He dropped to his knees, digging frantically with his hands. Brenna was beside him instantly, her strong fingers clawing at the earth. Martha joined them, then Ilara and the others, all desperate hands scrabbling in the dark. The dirt was cool and yielding, smelling of creek water and roots. They hit stones, pulled them away. More digging. Elias's fingers scraped against something hard and wet. Not earth, but rotted with planks, half buried and crumbling. Hope, sharp and desperate, flared. Together, Brenna ordered. They braced shoulders against the planks and the surrounding earth. With a collective heave born of terror and the will to survive, the rotten timbers gave way, collapsing inward. A rush of cold, blessedly clean air washed over them, carrying the scent of water and frost. Moonlight, faint and silver, filtered through a tangle of exposed tree roots and scrub brush. They had broken through to the creek bank, downstream from the cabin, hidden beneath the overhang. They scrambled to the jagged hole, one after another, emerging gasping onto the frost-rimed gravel beside Silver Creek. The scene upstream was apocalyptic. Whispering Pine's cabin was a roaring pyre, flames clawing at the night sky, casting monstrous, dancing shadows across the clearing. Embers drifted like malevolent fireflies. Figures moved near the inferno. Cade's men, silhouetted against the hellish glow, shouting, poking at the ruins. They hadn't found the cellar yet. The horses, Ilara whispered, staring at the spot where the barn had been, now just a mound of glowing embers. One got free, Elias said grimly, scanning the darkness beyond the creek. We move. Now. Follow the creek downstream. Keep to the water. Hide our tracks. He looked at Brenna. Cover our back trail? She nodded, hefting the rifle she kept through the chaos. Go. I'll make sure they don't follow easy. Her gaze flickered toward the burning cabin, then back to Elias. There was respect there and a shared understanding of the cost. Elias led the way, wading into the icy water of Silver Creek, the cold a shocking slap that cleared the smoke from his lungs. Ilara followed close behind. Then Martha, herding the two younger women. Brenna melted into the shadows upstream, a silent sentinel. They moved quickly, silently. The only sounds a rush of the creek, the distant roar of the fire, and the frantic pounding of their hearts. The moonlight painted the water silver, the frost on the banks glittering like shattered glass. They hadn't gone half a mile when a sharp whistle cut through the night. Not the chilling signal of Cade's men, but a different two-note call. Elias froze, signaling the others to crouch low behind a thicket of willow. A figure emerged from the trees on the far bank, leading a horse. It was the mount that had bolted from the burning barn. The man raised a hand in a gesture of peace. Moonlight glinted on a long, ragged scar running down his cheek. It was the man who had shot the broad-shouldered attacker in the cabin. "Name's Judd Kane," he called across the water, his voice low and rough. "Work for Cade. Not anymore. Not after what he did back there." He gestured upstream towards a glow. "Heard him brag gin about the girl being his blood, about the timber deed. Didn't sign on for killing kin. He spat into the creek. Saw you break out. Figured you could use the horse. And maybe directions." Elias eyed him warily, his hand resting on the butt of his coat. "Why help?" Kane shrugged, a weary movement. "Had a sister once. Cade's type they take what ain't theirs. Maybe this evens a score a little. There's an old trapper's cabin 10 miles south, near the bend of the Medicine Bow. Abandoned. Hard to find. Cade won't look there soon. Got a spare canteen." He tossed a leather-wrapped bundle across the creek. It landed at Elias's feet. "Go south. Keep to the high ground after the creek forks. You'll see the lightning-blasted pine. Cabins below it." He nodded towards Ilara, his expression unreadable in the gloom. "Good luck, hope. You'll need it." Before Elias could question him further, Kane turned, leading the other horse, and vanished in the trees as silently as he'd appeared. A gift or a trick, Elias couldn't be sure, but the horse was real, the directions plausible. They had no other options. He quickly distributed the meager supplies from Kane's bundle, jerky, matches, the canteen. He helped Ilara onto the horse, then boosted Martha up behind her. The two younger women would have to walk for now. Brenna reappeared moments later, her face grim. "They found the hole," she reported, "but the fire's spreading towards the creek bank. Bought us some time. They'll track us come daylight." They moved south, following the creek, the stolen horse a small blessing. Elias walked beside it, one hand resting near Ilara's leg, a gesture of reassurance he wasn't sure he felt. Cora's letter burned in his pocket, a physical weight. "She is Lena's daughter, my blood. She is the last piece of my heart." He looked up at Ilara, her profile etched against the moonlit sky. The resemblance was there now that he knew, around the eyes, the set of the jaw, not Cora, but Lena. A piece of Cora's past, her sacrifice, entrusted to him. Dawn was a slow stain on the eastern horizon, gray and cold, when they reached the fork Kane described. The fire's glow was gone, replaced by a column of dirty smoke staining the pale sky over whispering pines. They left the creek, climbing a rocky ridge as instructed. The land was harsh, beautiful in its desolation. Sagebrush silver with frost, the bitterroot peaks clawing at the lightening sky. Elias scanned the terrain, his eyes gritty with exhaustion. Then he saw it. A massive ponderosa pine, split down the middle by an old lightning strike, its charred trunk a stark sentinel against the ridge. Below it, nestled in a fold of hills, was a small, dilapidated log structure, its roof sagging but intact. Sanctuary. For now. They approached cautiously. The cabin was empty, dusty, smelling of old pelts and dry rot, but it was shelter. Elias barricaded the door as best he could with a broken table. The others collapsed onto the rough-hewn bunks or the earthen floor, spent. Ilara slid down from the horse, her legs trembling. She walked past Elias, out into the small clearing before the cabin. She stood looking north, towards the smoke and the ashes of whispering pines, towards the graves hidden by distance and destruction. Elias followed her. The rising sun painted the frost-covered sagebrush in hues of rose and gold, a cruel beauty after the night's horror. Ilara's shoulders shook silently. He stopped beside her, unsure what to say. Words fell hollow, inadequate vessel for the grief and revelation they both carried. She turned to him, tears tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. Without a word, she reached into the pocket of her tattered dress and pulled out the silver locket. She opened it, her fingers trembling. She looked at the faded blue scrap, then at the inscription, Ilara. Then, slowly, deliberately, she closed it and held it out to him. "It belongs with Aunt Cora," she whispered, her voice small but clear in the vast silence of the dawn. "With her and Michael. Will you take it back? When it's safe?" Elias looked at the small, tarnished oval in her palm. It wasn't just a locket. It was a chain of love and sacrifice, of secrets kept and truths revealed. It was Lena's legacy, Cora's burden, and now Ilara's trust. He took it gently, the metal cool against his skin. The weight of it was immense, carrying the echoes of the dead and the fragile hope of the living. "I will," he promised, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't name. He closed his hand around it. "When it's safe." He looked north again, towards the smoke. Silas Cave was still out there. The lawless wilderness stretched vast and unforgiving. The future was a treacherous trail, unmapped. But beside him stood Cora's last charge, Lena's daughter, a young woman forged in fire who had whispered his name in a forsaken place and shattered the ice around his heart. He had lost a home, but found a reason to walk beyond the ashes. He placed a hand, tentative but firm, on Ilara's shoulder. She didn't flinch. She leaned into the touch, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forged in the cellar's darkness and the dawn's fragile light. Together, they watched the sun rise over the stolen sanctuary, the locket heavy in Elias's pocket, a silent vow spoken to the wind and the watching peaks. The journey wasn't over, but they were no longer running alone.